try to think thoughtfully about the problem of rationality, because if we can't pose that question and consider it, we won't be able to understand the question about science. In his lectures on the philosophy of history, which Leo Strauss covers in his seminar, and he says these lectures weren't written by Hegel himself. Maybe ultimately they were, but but what we have is the lecture notes of the quote-unquote, according to Leo Strauss, intelligent students of Hegel. There's a beautiful metaphor near the end where he speaks of a blind man having become possessed of sight, and then the vision of the rising sun, the ascending sun. Heidegger here in his mirror, attempting to shew what is held in Nietzsche's second essay on history, the second essay from the Thoughts Out of Season, says, life, beyond itself, and back into itself, period, remaining with it and advancing toward it. Life beyond itself and back into itself. If it's beyond itself, then it's still, as it were, in opposition within itself. So what's beyond? The sun that's rising. We could say this is the same as Plato's idea of the good, the sun. Now let's see how this looks in Nietzsche's text in connection to Hegelian rationality. He speaks here of the idea realizing itself, quote unquote, the quote, dialectic of the spirit of the nations, quote, and the, quote, tribunal of the world. History understood in this Hegelian way has been contemptuously called God's sojourn upon earth. God, in a certain sense, identified as the Platonic idea of the good, the pure. So here's the concept of reason or rationality. They amount to the same thing here, just synonyms. He, at any rate, became transparent and intelligible inside Hegelian skulls. So this rationality or reason of history became manifest to the Hegelians. Later on, he says, later down in the passage, he says, if each success has come by a quote-unquote rational necessity and every event shows the victory of logic or the quote-unquote idea, then down on your knees quickly and let every step in the ladder of success have its reverence. Great majesty of this coming of the French Revolution in particular. What's the core idea here is the equality under the law. There's deep problems in that. What's another word for rule of law? They also call it nowadays the rule-based order. And quite a few people find that appealing, but whose rules and aren't rules? Don't rules sound like something somehow that have less majesty, less pretentious, as it were? It says rules, not laws, not justice necessarily. The rules-based order, realism, not a cause. Netanyahu says the Iranians have a cause. Over here, he points to the map to Saudi Arabia. This is the family business. He points to Iran. This is a cause. He points and he says, but we are about realism. So the rules-based order, the simple, not rationality in the sense of the Platonic philosophy, but more in the sense of a kind of instrumentality, getting things done and as best as one can. But that doesn't even get to the deeper difficulty. So in Kochev, I want to say, it's not that Kochev would say So if you think about Derrida's book on the ghosts of Marx, I believe it was called, I think it's there where he says, oh, we've already heard the stuff Fukuyama is bringing out in, I don't know when he wrote his first article, uh, um, have we come to the end of the history, question mark. And Fukuyama is extremely erudite, but he's absolutely on the side of empiricism. He doesn't care very much about philosophy as philosophy in the sense that Nietzsche would care about it, in the sense that Leo Strauss cares about it. And so, what does that mean for our question of rationality? It means I'll try to give an example out of Steven Pinker that will stand as a mirror for the whole thing. But remembering that if a mirror strikes a mirror, then we can get this great multiplicity of facets, like a mob running riot with each of the innumerable faces. Pinker says we must have, in his old book on the blank slate, he said we have to have an idea of human nature. So human nature, the idea of human nature is at the core of the Platonic philosophy project. You have to, Strauss calls that man as man. So as though there were a permanent idea of man or genus of man, and that his needs could be derived finally and scientifically out of the general category available to nous or the intellect. But how does Pinker derive his and this is the problem. This is goes to the problem of empiricism over everything that empiricism stretches over. He says he looks at societies in terms of trying to get representative data out of a sample space, but the sample space is invariably limited sample space. So for instance, he says that it is the case that we are more influenced by our peers in terms of our worldview, in terms of our political views, than by our parents on the whole, society on the whole. Of course, there's many cases where people are more influenced by their parents on their worldview. But he derives his data chiefly from the Western societies, from the Anglosphere, and that turns out to be absolutely true in the Anglosphere. But is the Anglosphere all societies in all time, all human? They're actually a minority data. So the problem with the empiricism is, and you can look at Alan McFarlane shows how the Anglosphere, the anthropologist at I think is at Cambridge, and he shows, he gives a very nice account of how this individualism, Anglo-Saxon individualism, arises. One of the main factors he brings out is that the Anglo-Saxons sent their children away from school at an early date, and that's been hundreds of years of that practice. So, of course, if you go away from school and you're in a sportive environment, as it were, competitive environment, in the sense of school competition, collegiate competition, then you'll be more influenced by your peers. And of course, today we have universal, almost universal schooling, right? So the conditions that are the empirical conditions cannot, when you derive a principle from the empirical conditions, you're not deriving a principle from man as man, or the human being as the idea, in the sense of the Platonic philosophy, in the sense of the idea of a genus standing in the mind of the universe, which is a permanent possibility. Even if there's no human beings alive now, there could still be human beings, and they would then be after that model. Then you have a ground for a scientific, or as it were, a permanent knowledge about that genus, or about that idea. You don't when you derive it empirically. So this breaks into the problem of reason in a serious way. The other, so how so far does that affect Hegel? Very greatly, I believe. because Hegel is prior to the theory of evolution, of the sovereignty of the becoming. But on the other hand, is it not so that the principle of equality under the law is extremely powerful and, in fact, unquestioned generally? Who would, whatever one says about problems of competency, for instance, I think this mentions Bug and Jordan Peterson always raise this question of competency versus the attempts at general equality. But those questions do not come to the point where they question equality under the law. Nobody questions equality under the law. Nobody says we should go back to the three estates in France with different regimes of law for the different estates. Okay, we just touched the surface again. I'm going to try to go immediately back into the same issues on the next recording.